hear the breathing behind the door. They've been waiting. How long now? The silence between heartbeats. That's when they crawl closer. Your reflection blinked first, someone else is wearing your face.
The Timothy Caldwell Chronicles, Anatomy of Evil. A psychological horror case study, Missouri, 1867. Prologue. The Nature of Darkness. Dr. Samuel Harding's Personal Journal, entry number 1, June 14th, 1867. There are nights when I question whether I should have remained a surgeon on the battlefield. At least there, the enemy wore a uniform. The wounds were honest, bullets that tore through flesh, shrapnel that shredded organs. Death arrived with the sound of cannons, not with the quiet footsteps of a child. Post-Civil War Missouri bleeds in ways the history books won't capture. Towns like Sedalia sent their sons to die at Gettysburg and Antietam, leaving behind widows who aged decades in months, and children who learned that God doesn't always answer prayers. The soil here is rich with blood and broken promises. But what I'm about to document isn't the aftermath of war. It's something older, something that makes me question whether evil is learned, or whether some souls arrive in this world already corrupted, like fruit rotting from the inside before it ever ripens. His name is Timothy Caldwell. He is 8 years old, and I believe he may be the most dangerous human being I have ever encountered. Chapter 1. Arrival at the Caldwell Farm, August 3rd, 1867. The wagon wheels crackled over dried mud as Thomas Caldwell's cart approached the farmhouse. I happened to be visiting that afternoon, treating Sarah Caldwell for her recurring migraines, headaches that would, I now realize, only worsen with the arrival of the boy. When Timothy stepped down from that wagon, everything changed. I've delivered over 300 babies in my career. I've watched children grow from squalling infants to rowdy adolescents. I understand the rhythms of childhood, the awkward movements, the unpredictable emotional outbursts, and the gradual development of social awareness. Timothy Caldwell displayed none of these normal markers. His movements were economical, precise. He placed his feet with deliberation of a chess player positioning pieces. When he spoke, his voice carried an unnatural formality. "Thank you for taking me in, sir. I will endeavor to earn my keep." These weren't phrases an 8-year-old cobbles together from eavesdropping on adults. This was rehearsed, calculated. But it was his eyes that made my blood run cold. Pale blue, like ice over deep water. When Timothy looked at you, he wasn't simply seeing, he was cataloging, measuring, assessing. His gaze moved across faces the way I examined cadavers during my medical training, with clinical detachment and scientific curiosity. Thomas Caldwell, oblivious to the wrongness emanating from the boy, clapped a heavy hand on Timothy's shoulder. "This here's my nephew, orphaned by the war. We'll make a farmer of him yet." Sarah managed a tight smile, but I noticed her hands trembling as she smoothed her apron. Some primal part of her recognized the predator now standing in her home. The farm's animals certainly did. Old Brutus, Thomas's cattle dog had never cowered from anything in his 12 years, not coyotes, not strangers, not even the time a black bear wandered through the north pasture. But when Timothy approached to pet him, Brutus retreated with his tail between his legs, whimpering like a puppy that had been beaten. The chickens stopped clucking. The horses in the barn grew restless, stamping and snorting. Even the flies seemed to avoid the boy, as if insects possessed some awareness that larger creatures lacked. That first night, I stayed for supper at Sarah's insistence. Timothy sat across from me, eating with perfect table manners, answering questions with appropriate responses. He was the model of a well-behaved child. Except that he never blinked. I counted. For 7 full minutes while we ate, Timothy Caldwell did not blink once. His pale eyes remained fixed, unblinking, studying each of us in turn, like specimens pinned to a board. When I finally returned home that evening, I immediately began this journal. Medical documentation, I told myself. Objective observation of an unusual case study. But even then, some part of me knew I wasn't documenting a patient, I was tracking a predator. The farm, I would later realize, had just been chosen as a hunting ground.
Chapter 2. The Patient Hunter. August 5th to September 15th, 1867. Timothy adapted to farm life with disturbing efficiency. Within 3 days, he had memorized every chore, every routine, every pattern of movement on the Caldwell property. He worked without complaint from dawn until dusk, never tiring, never slowing. Sarah Caldwell confided to me during one of my visits, "It's unnatural, Samuel. He works like a machine, never stops to play, never asks for anything. Sometimes I catch him just standing there in the barn, staring at nothing, or maybe staring at something I can't see." I began making excuses to visit the Caldwell farm more frequently, checking Thomas's old war injury, bringing Sarah tinctures for her headaches. In truth, I was studying Timothy. The boy seemed to sense my scrutiny. During one visit, he approached me directly while I was examining one of the plow horses. "Dr. Harding, may I ask you a question?" His voice carried no childish enthusiasm or nervousness, just cold curiosity. "Of course, Timothy. When you were a surgeon during the war, how did you determine which soldiers would live and which would die?" The question struck me like a physical blow. This wasn't morbid curiosity of the sort children sometimes display. This was methodical information gathering. "Well," I replied carefully, "we assessed the severity of wounds, blood loss, whether vital organs were damaged. How long does it take for someone to die from blood loss if, say, the femoral artery is severed?" My hand stilled on the horse's flank. "That's a rather specific question, Timothy." He tilted his head, and for just a moment something flickered behind those pale eyes, something cold and calculating and utterly inhuman. "Uncle Thomas says I should understand how things work. He says knowledge is important." "Knowledge is indeed important," I replied slowly. "But some knowledge carries weight that children shouldn't bear." "Children see more than adults think," he said softly. "We understand things you prefer to ignore." Then he turned and walked away, leaving me standing in the barn with my hands shaking and my mind racing with implications I wasn't ready to accept. Chapter 3. Mary Fletcher, The first victim. September 18th, 1867. Mary Fletcher was 12 years old. Daughter of the local blacksmith, she had a laugh that could light up a room and a fearless spirit that sometimes worried her parents. She loved climbing trees, catching frogs in Willow Creek, and sneaking sugar cookies from her mother's kitchen. I knew Mary well. I'd treated her for a broken arm 2 years prior when she'd fallen from an oak tree. She joked through the pain, making her worried mother smile despite the circumstances. On the afternoon of September 18th, Timothy Caldwell became Timothy Caldwell's first confirmed victim. The official story, the one that would appear in county records, stated that Mary had drowned while playing alone near Willow Creek, a tragic accident. Children sometimes slipped on wet rocks, hit their heads, fell into the water unconscious. But I examined Mary Fletcher's body, and accidents don't leave finger-shaped bruises on ankles. Timothy discovered the body, of course. He arrived at the Fletcher household just as the family was sitting down to supper, his clothes damp, his face pale with what appeared to be genuine distress. "Mrs. Fletcher," he said, his voice trembling perfectly. "I found Mary by the creek. She's not breathing." The chaos that followed was the kind of desperate panic that accompanies every parent's worst nightmare. We rushed to the creek, myself, Thomas, the Fletchers, and half a dozen neighbors who'd heard the screaming. Mary lay face down in water, barely 18 inches deep. Her dress was caught on a submerged branch, her blonde hair spread like seaweed around her pale face. We pulled her out, tried desperately to revive her, but she was gone. While the adults wept and prayed, I forced myself into the clinical detachment that had served me during the war. I examined Mary Fletcher's body as discreetly as possible. The bruises on her ankles were subtle, easy to miss if you weren't looking. They formed a pattern, thumb on one side, 4 fingers on the other. Someone had gripped her ankles with considerable force. Her fingernails were dirty, packed with soil and something else, something that looked like skin beneath the microscope in my office. Her lungs were full of water, yes, but there were also signs of struggle that didn't match a simple drowning. Petechial hemorrhages in her eyes, defensive wounds on her hands that suggested she'd fought against something or someone. When I returned to question Timothy, he provided an account with disturbing precision. "I was looking for Uncle Thomas's calf that had wandered off. I heard splashing near the creek and went to investigate. Mary was face down in the water. I tried to pull her out, but she was caught on a branch. By the time I freed her, she wasn't breathing anymore." Every detail was plausible, every emotion perfectly calibrated. But I noticed his hands were clean, too clean for someone who'd allegedly struggled to pull a body from muddy water. At Mary Fletcher's funeral 3 days later, I watched Timothy Caldwell. While adults wept and children clutched their parents' hands, Timothy sat quietly, his head bowed in apparent prayer. But when he thought no one was watching, his pale eyes tracked every person in the church with predatory focus. And when Mary's mother collapsed in grief, when grown men broke down sobbing, Timothy's expression showed no sympathy, no sadness, only satisfaction. And then, for just a moment, our eyes met. Timothy smiled, a small private smile that communicated more than words ever could. "I know that you know, and there's nothing you can do about it.
Chapter 4. Dr. Harding's investigation begins. September 20th to October 31st, 1867. I am a man of science. I was trained to observe, document, and analyze. Superstition and folklore have no place in medicine. When soldiers whispered about ghosts on the battlefield, I attributed it to trauma and exhaustion. When farmers talked about hexes and curses, I smiled politely and prescribed tonics for their very real ailments. But Timothy Caldwell forced me to confront the possibility that evil, pure, calculated, malevolent evil, could exist independent of environment, upbringing, or circumstance. I began a covert investigation. Using my position as the community's physician, I made routine visits to farms throughout the region, ostensibly checking on families recovering from war hardships. In reality, gathering data about Timothy Caldwell. What I discovered painted a disturbing picture. October 3rd, Eleanor Patterson's farm, bordering the Caldwell property. 17 chickens dead over the past month, each killed with identical precision, necks broken with surgical accuracy at the C2 vertebra. No signs of predation. Eleanor mentioned seeing Timothy near her property line the morning before each discovery. October 9th, James Wickham's cattle ranch 2 miles east. 3 calves dead in seemingly impossible accidents. One strangled by a rope that had been looped around its neck in a manner requiring human intervention. Another with its leg wedged in a fence designed to prevent such occurrences. James recalled Timothy asking detailed questions about cattle behavior and anatomy during a visit. October 15th, Robert Dunham's prize bull found at the bottom of a ditch with a broken leg. The animal had to be put down, a significant financial loss. The ditch had been partially filled with loose soil the day before, creating a hidden trap. Timothy had been seen walking the property line that same afternoon. The pattern was clear. Timothy was conducting experiments. Escalating experiments, learning, testing, refining his methods. But livestock wasn't enough. He needed human subjects. I confronted Thomas and Sarah Caldwell with my concerns, carefully omitting my more disturbing theories. Has Timothy displayed any unusual behaviors, any concerning patterns? Thomas laughed. The boy's a godsend, Samuel. Works harder than any grown man. Never complains, never causes trouble. Best thing to happen to this farm since before the war. Sarah was less enthusiastic. He's different, quiet. Sometimes I feel like he's studying us, not living with us, and the way the animals react to him. She trailed off, unwilling to voice her deeper fears. I pressed gently. Has he shown interest in violence? Asked disturbing questions? Thomas's expression hardened. That's enough, Samuel. The boy lost his parents. He's been through trauma. Whatever quirks he has, he'll grow out of them. Now, unless you have medical business here, I think we're done with this conversation. I left frustrated, but not discouraged. I simply needed more evidence. Evidence that, tragically, would come at the cost of more lives.
Chapter 5. Henrik Larsson, Lesson in Gravity. November 2nd, 1867. Henrik Larsson was what polite society called a difficult man. 43 years old, widowed by consumption 3 years prior, He descended into a bottle and never quite climbed back out. His farm bordered the Caldwell property to the north, and Henrik had a habit of wandering the property lines when drunk, cursing God, the war, and anyone else who'd listen. More importantly, Henrik had taken a dislike to Timothy Caldwell. "That boy ain't right," Henrik told anyone who'd listened at McGillicuddy's saloon. "Eyes like a dead fish, moves like he's got clockwork in his bones instead of blood. Mark my words, trouble follows that child like flies follow shit." Henrik's drinking had made him loose with his tongue, and his suspicions about Timothy had grown increasingly vocal. He'd started asking uncomfortable questions around town. Why did so many animals die when the boy was near? Why did children seem afraid of him? Why did Timothy watch people with the intensity of a hawk studying prey? On the morning of November 2nd, I received word that Henrik Larsson had been found dead at the base of Miller's Bluff. The cliff face rose 35 feet above Willow Creek, a limestone outcropping that local children used for daredevil jumps into the deeper pools below. It was treacherous terrain even for sober, experienced climbers. For a drunk like Henrik, it should have been avoided entirely. But according to witness testimony, Henrik had been seen arguing with someone near the bluff just after dawn. The witness, old Martha Henley, walking to collect eggs from her chicken coop, was too far away to identify Henrik's companion. She heard raised voices, then a scream, then silence. Martha found Henrik's body herself 20 minutes later, his skull cracked open like an egg, brain matter scattered across the rocks. Timothy Caldwell discovered the scene shortly after Martha's arrival. "I heard Mrs. Henley screaming," Timothy explained to the hastily assembled crowd. "When I got here, she was standing over Mr. Larsson. I tried to check if he was still breathing, but..." He gestured helplessly at the obvious trauma. Again, the perfect performance. The trembling voice, the wide, innocent eyes, the careful positioning of himself as a helpful observer rather than a participant. But when I examined Henrik's body, the evidence told a different story. Henrik's hands were scraped and bloody, not from the fall, but from gripping limestone. The pattern of his injuries suggested he'd been hanging from the cliff edge, fighting to pull himself up when something caused him to fall. More disturbing were the boot prints I found near the edge of the bluff. Small prints, child-sized. The depth and spacing suggested someone had been positioned directly above where Henrik would have been hanging, stamping down rather than simply walking. Henrik Larsson hadn't fallen accidentally. He'd been pushed, and when he tried to save himself, small boots had crushed his fingers until he lost his grip. I confronted Timothy privately that evening, finding him in the Caldwell barn, methodically cleaning his boots. "Terrible tragedy, what happened to Mr. Larsson," I said carefully. Timothy looked up, his expression perfectly composed. "Yes, Dr. Harding. Uncle Thomas says drink makes people do dangerous things. Perhaps Mr. Larsson shouldn't have been climbing cliffs." "Indeed. Though I'm curious, what were you doing near Miller's Bluff so early in the morning?" Timothy's hands never stopped their methodical cleaning motion. "Uncle Thomas sent me to check on the cattle in the north pasture. They sometimes wander toward the creek." "I see. And you heard Mrs. Henley screaming from the north pasture?" For the first time, Timothy's hands stilled. The question had revealed a geographical impossibility. The north pasture was over half a mile from Miller's Bluff, with hills in between that would have muffled any sound. Timothy looked directly at me then, and I saw something shift behind those pale eyes. The mask of childhood innocence slipped, just for a moment, revealing the calculating intelligence beneath. Sound travels strangely near the creek, Dr. Harding. Sometimes you hear things you shouldn't be able to hear. Sometimes you see things other people miss. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Timothy knew that I suspected him, and he was warning me that my investigation had not gone unnoticed. That night, I wrote in my journal, November 2nd, Henrik Larsson dead, murder disguised as accident. The boy grows bolder. More concerning, he knows I'm watching. How long before I become inconvenient enough to eliminate? God help me. I'm afraid of an 8-year-old child.
Chapter 6: The Laboratory of Suffering. November 15, 1867. The limestone caves northwest of the Caldwell property had been carved by centuries of spring runoff from Willow Creek. Local children sometimes explored the shallow passages during summer months, but the caves were considered dangerous, prone to collapse, home to bats and snakes, filled with sudden drops and unstable footing. I'd noticed Timothy disappearing in the direction of the caves during my visits, always with some plausible explanation. Hunting rabbits, collecting herbs Sarah had requested, checking for lost livestock. But Timothy Caldwell wasn't foraging or hunting. He was building something. On the night of November 15th, armed with a lantern and my service revolver, I followed Timothy's trail into the cave system. What I discovered there will haunt me until the day I die. The main passage led 30 yards into the hillside before opening into a natural chamber roughly 12 feet square. Timothy had transformed this space into what could only be described as a laboratory, a workshop dedicated to the scientific study of suffering. The walls were covered with drawings executed in charcoal and what appeared to be dried blood. Not the crude sketches of a child, but anatomical diagrams displaying a sophisticated understanding of human and animal physiology. Detailed renderings of the nervous system, with arrows pointing to pressure points and nerve clusters. A cross-section showing the placement of major arteries and organs. Diagrams illustrating the mechanics of strangulation, drowning, and blunt force trauma. Time charts documenting the progression of various injuries from infliction to death. Along one wall, Timothy had arranged a collection of improvised surgical instruments, sharpened fence posts, modified kitchen knives, pieces of broken glass carefully wrapped with cloth handles. Each tool showed signs of use. But it was the journal that truly revealed the scope of Timothy's activities. Written in a child's careful handwriting, it contained detailed observations and experimental data. Subject number 7, rabbit. Removal of left hind limb at femur. Consciousness maintained for 9 minutes post-amputation using tourniquet technique. Vocalizations ceased after minute 4. Blood loss appears controllable with proper pressure application. Subject number 12, calf. Gradual constriction of trachea using rope and pulley system. Full unconsciousness achieved in 3 minutes 47 seconds. Revival possible within 4-minute window if pressure released. Human subjects display significantly greater psychological response to anticipated pain versus actual physical trauma. Terror appears to be more debilitating than injury itself. Note: adult subjects demonstrate protective instincts toward young. Threatening children produces more extreme behavioral responses than direct personal threat. Page after page of clinical observations, methodical documentation, scientific analysis. Timothy Caldwell was conducting systematic research into the mechanics of fear, pain, and death. Most chilling were the pages labeled "Future Subjects," detailed profiles of every person in our community. Thomas Caldwell, age 47. War injury to left leg affects mobility. Responds strongly to authority figures. Weakness, excessive trust in appearances. Psychological vulnerability, fear of not fighting in war due to injury. Method, gradual isolation from support systems. Sarah Caldwell, age 43. Suffers from recurring headaches and nervous disposition. Highly protective of family. Weakness, maternal instincts override logical assessment. Method, gradual isolation from support systems. Dr. Samuel Harding, age 38. Extensive medical training, battlefield experience. High intelligence poses significant challenge. Direct confrontation inadvisable. Weakness, professional obligation to community overrides self-preservation. Method, discredit professionally, then eliminate when isolated. Timothy had been studying us all, learning our habits, our fears, our weaknesses, planning our destructions with the same methodical care a general uses to design a battle campaign. I was so absorbed in reading that I failed to notice the footsteps behind me until it was almost too late. "You're earlier than I calculated, Dr. Harding." I spun around to find Timothy standing in the cave entrance, effectively blocking my only exit. In the flickering lantern light, his pale eyes seemed to glow with their own cold fire. "You projected another 2 weeks before you'd work up the courage for direct investigation." My hand moved instinctively toward my revolver, but Timothy made no threatening moves. Instead, he walked calmly to the journal and closed it carefully. "You've seen my work. What do you think?" The casual tone was somehow more terrifying than any scream or threat. This was a professional discussing his craft with a colleague. "What are you?" I whispered. Timothy tilted his head, considering the question with genuine interest. "I'm evolution, Dr. Harding. I'm what happens when empathy fails to develop and intelligence fills the void. Most children learn to mirror emotions, to simulate caring because it makes others comfortable. I never learned that skill, or perhaps I learned something more useful." He picked up one of his makeshift scalpels, turning it in his small hands with practiced familiarity. "Do you know what I discovered during my research? Empathy is an evolutionary mistake. It makes creatures vulnerable, causes them to sacrifice their own survival for others. But sociopathy paired with high intelligence, that's the future of human development. Predators who can perfectly mimic prey. You can't kill me, you know, not because you don't want to. I can see in your eyes that you do, but because your conditioning won't allow it. You've taken an oath to do no harm. You can't reconcile murdering a child, even a child like me. That moral framework is what makes you inferior." He was right, and we both knew it. My finger rested on the trigger, but I couldn't pull it. Everything I'd been taught, everything I believed about right and wrong, prevented me from executing an 8-year-old boy. no matter what he'd done. Timothy smiled, the same cold, predatory expression I'd glimpsed after Mary Fletcher's funeral. "But don't worry, Dr. Harding. You won't have to live with the moral complexity much longer. I've learned everything useful from this community. It's time to move on to larger experiments." He moved toward me with fluid grace, and I saw the glint of steel in his hand. My paralysis broke. I struck out with the lantern, catching Timothy across the shoulder and sending him sprawling against the cave wall. The lantern shattered, plunging us into darkness. I ran. Behind me, I heard Timothy's voice, calm and conversational despite the chaos. "This isn't over, Dr. Harding. I'll be seeing you very soon."
Chapter 7. Jacob Mills, The Perfect Crime. November 28, 1867. After discovering Timothy's laboratory, I knew I had to act. But how do you convince an entire community that their model child is actually a calculating predator? How do you explain evidence that defies rational explanation? I tried approaching Sheriff Morrison with my concerns, carefully presenting only the most objective observations. Morrison listened politely, then suggested I might be suffering from war nerves, what we now call post-traumatic stress. I attempted to warn Thomas and Sarah Caldwell again, but Thomas had grown defensive about his nephew. Any criticism of Timothy was met with hostility and accusations that I was persecuting an orphaned child. Meanwhile, Timothy continued his facade of perfect behavior, helping with farm chores, attending church services, participating in community events. To outside observers, he was a model of childhood virtue, recovering admirably from family tragedy. Only I could see the predator stalking beneath the surface. On November 28th, that predator claimed his most devastating victim yet. Jacob Mills was 9 years old, the only son of Robert and Alina Mills. A bright, curious boy who loved fishing, collecting rocks, and exploring the countryside around Sedalia. Jacob had befriended Timothy, or rather, Timothy had carefully cultivated the friendship. The two boys were often seen together, Timothy playing the role of older brother with devastating effectiveness. He taught Jacob card games, shared candy, listened to the younger boy's endless chatter with apparent patience and interest. What Jacob didn't realize was that Timothy was studying him, learning his routines, his fears, his weaknesses, preparing him for harvest. On the morning of November 28th, Timothy and Jacob set out for what was supposed to be a fishing expedition at Willow Creek. They carried poles, bait, and a lunch Sarah Caldwell had packed for them, a normal childhood adventure. Only Timothy returned. He arrived at the Mills household just as the family was sitting down to supper, his clothes dirty, his face streaked with what appeared to be tears. "Mr. Mills, Mrs. Mills, Jacob wandered off while we were fishing. I've been looking for him all afternoon, but I can't find him anywhere. I'm so sorry. I should have watched him more carefully." The search party that formed included 23 men from the surrounding farms. We combed the countryside for 3 days, calling Jacob's name, checking every barn, every creek, every cave in a 5-mile radius. Timothy participated in the search with apparent dedication, suggesting areas to explore, sharing details about Jacob's last known activities. He was helpful, cooperative, devastated by his friend's disappearance. On the 3rd day, we found Jacob Mills at the bottom of the old Henley well. The well had been abandoned years earlier when it went dry. It was 22 feet deep, narrow, surrounded by rotting boards that made it nearly invisible in the overgrown weeds. A perfect trap. Jacob was still alive when we found him. He'd been calling for help for 3 days, his voice growing weaker as dehydration and hypothermia took their toll. When we pulled him up, he was barely conscious, his lips cracked, his body trembling uncontrollably. But he was aware enough to speak, and what he told us changed everything. "Timothy pushed me," Jacob whispered as I examined him. "He said he wanted to show me something interesting. Then he pushed me and covered the well with boards. I kept calling, but he just looked down at me and smiled." Jacob Miles died 20 minutes later in my arms, his small body finally succumbing to exposure and trauma. I immediately reported Jacob's final words to Sheriff Morrison, demanding Timothy's arrest for murder. Morrison was reluctant, but agreed to question the boy. Timothy's response was a masterpiece of manipulation. "Jacob was very upset about something that day. He kept talking about wanting to disappear, wanting to hide somewhere no one could find him. I tried to cheer him up, but he ran off into the woods. I looked for him, but I got scared and went home. I should have tried harder to find him. It's my fault he's dead." Timothy's performance was flawless. He accepted responsibility for not trying hard enough to find Jacob, displaying appropriate guilt and remorse. His story painted Jacob as a troubled, possibly suicidal child who'd hidden himself away and fallen into the well accidentally. The community wanted to believe Timothy's version. A tragic accident was easier to accept than deliberate murder by a child. Timothy's grief appeared genuine, his self-blame believable. Only I knew the truth. Timothy Caldwell had just committed the perfect crime. A 9-year-old boy was dead, and his killer would face no consequences beyond sympathy for his traumatic experience. That night, as Jacob Mills's parents planned their son's funeral, I made a decision that would change the course of my life forever. Timothy Caldwell had to be stopped. And if the legal system wouldn't protect our community, I would have to find another way.
Chapter 8, The Confrontation, December 15th, 1867. I spent 2 weeks planning, 2 weeks watching Timothy's routines, studying his movements, waiting for the perfect opportunity. The boy had made one crucial error. He assumed I was bound by the same moral constraints that had paralyzed me in the cave. But Jacob Mills's death had changed something fundamental in my thinking. I was no longer looking at Timothy Caldwell as a patient or even as a child. I was looking at him as what he truly was, a predator that had to be eliminated before it could kill again. On the evening of December 15th, I knew Timothy would be alone. Thomas was in town for a Grange meeting that would last past midnight. Sarah was visiting her sister in Springfield and wouldn't return until morning. The farmhouse would be empty except for the boy. I approached the Caldwell property armed with my service revolver, a coil of rope, and a bottle of laudanum. My plan was simple: subdue Timothy, transport him to a location where we couldn't be interrupted, and extract a full confession. What would happen after that confession, I preferred not to think about too carefully. I found Timothy in the barn, methodically cleaning tack by lamplight. He looked up when I entered, showing no surprise at my unexpected arrival. "Good evening, Dr. Harding. You're out rather late." "We need to talk, Timothy." He set down the leather he'd been cleaning and turned to face me fully. Even in the flickering lamplight, his pale eyes seemed to glow with predator awareness. "I assume this is about Jacob Mills." The casual directness caught me off guard. No pretense, no childish confusion about why I might be upset. Just acknowledgement of the obvious. "You killed him." Timothy considered this statement with the same intellectual curiosity he might apply to a mathematical problem. Yes, though killed implies intention from the beginning. I was actually conducting an experiment in psychological endurance. Jacob's death was an unexpected variable. The clinical detachment in his voice was more chilling than any passionate confession would have been. He was discussing murder, the way another child might describe catching fireflies. You pushed a 9-year-old boy into a well and left him to die. I wanted to observe human behavior under extreme stress. How long would Jacob continue calling for help? At what point would hope transform into despair? Would isolation accelerate psychological breakdown? These are valuable questions, Dr. Harding. Jacob's suffering contributed to scientific understanding. I drew my revolver, pointing it directly at Timothy's chest. The boy looked down at the weapon with mild interest, as if I'd shown him an unusual insect. "Are you going to shoot me, Dr. Harding?" "I think I am." Timothy smiled, that same cold predator expression that had haunted my dreams for months. "No, you're not, because shooting me won't solve your problem. It will create new ones." He was stalling, I realized. But stalling for what? Think carefully, Dr. Harding. What happens when Thomas and Sarah return to find my bullet-riddled corpse in their barn? How will you explain executing an 8-year-old child? Who will believe your stories about murder and experimentation? You'll be arrested, tried, and hanged for child murder. His logic was infuriatingly sound. Even if I could prove Timothy's guilt, killing him would destroy my own life. But more importantly, Timothy continued, stepping closer despite the weapon aimed at his chest, you'll never know how many others there are. Others? Did you think I was unique? The only child born without empathy, without moral constraints? I've been corresponding with similar individuals across the country. There are more of us than you might imagine. Some are older, more experienced. Some have learned to blend into society so perfectly, they'll never be detected. Timothy reached into his pocket and withdrew a bundle of letters. Even in the lamplight, I could see childish handwriting on several envelopes. Children like me don't emerge randomly. We're the next step in human evolution. While ordinary people are limited by empathy, guilt, and moral frameworks, we're free to pursue our goals without restraint. We're stronger, smarter, more adaptable. We're what humanity is becoming. He set the letters on a nearby hay bale, close enough for me to see return addresses from cities across America: Boston, Chicago, New Orleans, San Francisco. Children like me don't emerge randomly. We're the next step in human evolution. While ordinary people are limited by empathy, guilt, and moral frameworks, we're free to pursue our goals without restraint. We're stronger, smarter, more adaptable. We're what humanity is becoming. My finger trembled on the trigger. Every instinct screamed at me to end this conversation with a bullet. But Timothy's words had planted a seed of terrible possibility. What if he wasn't unique? What if there were others? "What do you want?" I heard myself asking. Timothy's smile widened, and I realized I'd just lost a battle I didn't know I was fighting. "I want to continue my research, but I need a more sophisticated environment, larger subject pools, better equipment, academic resources." "You want me to help you kill more people." "I want you to help me understand how to kill people more efficiently."
Think of the knowledge we could acquire, the insights into human psychology, pain tolerance, fear responses. Imagine the applications, military interrogation techniques, criminal prosecution methods, medical procedures that could be refined. The worst part was that some corner of my mind found his proposal intellectually fascinating. The scientific questions he raised were legitimate, even if his methods were monstrous. There's a private psychiatric facility in St. Louis, Missouri, the Missouri State Hospital. They accept patients with unusual mental conditions. I would have access to other patients, controlled conditions for experimentation, and medical supervision to ensure my research doesn't attract unwanted attention. You want me to deliver you to a hospital full of helpless patients so you can torture them systematically. I want you to provide me with an environment where I can pursue my research while developing into a productive member of society. Consider the alternative, Dr. Harding. I continue operating here in your community, among people you care about. How many more Jacob Millses will die before you work up the courage to stop me? The threat was clear. Timothy would continue killing locally unless I helped relocate his activities to a more distant venue. I found myself facing an impossible choice: become complicit in Timothy's future crimes by facilitating his institutionalization, or allow him to continue murdering children in our community. You have 48 hours to decide, Dr. Harding. After that, I begin selecting my next local subject. I've been watching the Morrison children. Little Susan is particularly trusting. Timothy walked past me toward the barn door, moving with casual confidence despite the weapon still pointed at his back. Oh, and Dr. Harding, if you try to shoot me, or if anything happens to me that might be considered suspicious, detailed letters describing our conversation will be delivered to Sheriff Morrison, the county prosecutor, and the territorial governor. I've been documenting our relationship for months. Any harm that comes to me will be traced directly to your obsession with an innocent child. He paused in the doorway, looking back with that same cold smile. Sweet dreams, Doctor.
Chapter 9, The Devil's Bargain, December 17th, 1867. I didn't sleep for 2 days. Timothy's proposition consumed my thoughts like a fever. The rational part of my mind recognized it as manipulation, a predator negotiating for better hunting grounds. But the practical side whispered uncomfortable truths. Timothy would continue killing regardless of my decision. At least in an institutional setting, his victims would be adults rather than children. His research might even produce insights that could help identify other individuals like him. These justifications felt hollow, even as I constructed them, but they provided enough psychological scaffolding to support what I was contemplating. On the morning of December 17th, I rode to St. Louis. The Missouri State Hospital was a grim brick fortress surrounded by iron gates and bare winter trees. Dr. Harrison Wickham, the chief psychiatrist, received me in his office, a cramped space that smelled of carbolic acid and human desperation. I presented Timothy's case carefully, describing him as a war orphan suffering from dissociative episodes and unusual behavioral manifestations following family trauma. I emphasized his high intelligence, his disturbing questions about death and injury, his apparent lack of normal emotional responses. The boy requires intensive study and treatment, I explained. He's too intelligent to benefit from standard approaches, and his condition appears to be deteriorating. Without proper intervention, I fear he may become dangerous to himself or others." Dr. Wickham listened with professional interest. The hospital, he explained, specialized in unusual cases that couldn't be treated effectively in general medical settings. They had experience with child patients displaying antisocial tendencies. "We've seen similar presentations," Wickham said. "War trauma affects children differently than adults. Sometimes it strips away normal emotional development, leaving them functionally detached from human connections. With proper care, many of these children can be rehabilitated." I signed the commitment papers that afternoon. The legal language was clinical and impersonal. Patient exhibits signs of severe psychological disturbance, including emotional detachment, morbid curiosity regarding death and injury, and apparent lack of empathy toward others. Patient requires intensive psychiatric evaluation and treatment in a secure environment. Nowhere in the documentation did I mention murder. Nowhere did I describe Timothy's true nature. I was delivering a calculating killer into a facility full of vulnerable patients, and I was disguising my action as medical intervention. When I returned to Sedalia, I found Timothy waiting in my office. "I assume your trip to St. Louis was productive." He sat in my patient chair with perfect posture, hands folded, expression attentive. He looked like any other 8-year-old child brought to see the doctor. "The Missouri State Hospital has agreed to accept you as a patient." Timothy nodded approvingly. "Dr. Wickham has an excellent reputation. His research into criminal psychology is quite advanced. I look forward to working with him." Working with him? Learning from him initially, eventually contributing to his research. Dr. Wickham doesn't yet realize it, but he's about to acquire a very valuable case study. The matter-of-fact way Timothy discussed manipulating a respected psychiatrist made my blood run cold. But I had already set the wheels in motion. "There are conditions," I said. "You will not harm anyone at the hospital. You will cooperate with treatment. You will—" Timothy raised a hand, interrupting me with a gesture no child should possess. "Dr. Harding, we both know you're not in a position to dictate conditions. You're facilitating my relocation because it serves your interests, not because you have any control over my activities. Once I'm institutionalized, our arrangement ends. What happens after that is entirely my decision." He stood up, smoothing his clothes with deliberate care. "But I will offer you this assurance. My future research will be conducted with greater discretion than my recent local experiments. I've learned valuable lessons about maintaining appropriate cover stories and avoiding unnecessary attention." "You're promising to be a more careful killer?" "I'm promising to be a more effective researcher. The killing is simply a tool, sometimes necessary, sometimes not. As my methods become more sophisticated, I expect the mortality rate among my subjects will actually decrease." The casual way he discussed murder as a research methodology made me question whether I was making a terrible mistake. But what choice did I have? Timothy would continue his activities regardless of my involvement. At least this way, his victims would be strangers rather than neighbors. "When do we leave for St. Louis?" Timothy asked. "Tomorrow morning. I've told Thomas and Sarah that you are being transferred to a specialized school for gifted children. They believe this is an opportunity for you to receive education more appropriate to your intellectual abilities." Timothy smiled, the expression I'd learned to fear above all others. "In a sense, that's true. I will be receiving a very specialized education,
and Dr. Wickham will learn things about human psychology that no textbook could teach him. That night, I wrote what I believed would be my final journal entry about Timothy Caldwell. December 17th. The arrangement is complete. Tomorrow, I deliver the boy to St. Louis, where he becomes someone else's responsibility. I tell myself this is the best possible outcome, removing him from our community while ensuring he receives professional observation. But I know the truth. I am placing a predator among prey and calling it medical treatment. God forgive me for what I am about to do, and God help the staff and patients at Missouri State Hospital. I sealed the journal in my desk drawer, hoping I would never have reason to open it again. I was wrong.
Chapter 10. The Missouri State Hospital. January 15th, October 31st, 1868. Dr. Harrison Wickham's monthly reports arrived with clockwork regularity, each one documenting Timothy Caldwell's remarkable progress and fascinating psychological presentation. Reading between the lines of these clinical updates, I could trace the subtle conquest of an entire psychiatric facility. January 15th report. Patient TC has adapted well to institutional routine, displays exceptional intelligence and curiosity about medical procedures, shows particular interest in anatomy texts and psychiatric evaluation methods. Staff report unusual maturity for child of his age, recommend continued observation and gradual integration with other patients. February 28th report. Patient TC continues to exceed expectations, has established positive relationships with several adult patients, demonstrating empathetic behavior previously absent from his psychological profile. Appears to be responding well to therapeutic environment. 2 patients in his ward have shown remarkable improvement in their conditions. This second report troubled me. Timothy didn't experience empathy, he mimicked it. If patients were improving under his influence, it meant he was manipulating them successfully. April 10th report. Unusual incident involving patient TC. Found in restricted area of hospital examining surgical instruments. Claims to have been helping with equipment inventory. Patient demonstrates advanced understanding of medical tools and procedures. Staff member who discovered him reported feeling unsettled by patient's detailed questions about surgical applications. Recommend increased supervision during medical procedures. June 3rd report. Patient TC has become informal leader among child patients. Adult patients also seek his companionship. Staff describe him as remarkably insightful and naturally therapeutic in his interactions. However, 3 patients have died in the past month. 2 suicides, 1 from sudden cardiac arrest. All had been receiving individual attention from patient TC prior to their deaths. Possible correlation or unfortunate coincidence. The euphemistic language couldn't disguise what was happening. Timothy was conducting his research using hospital patients as subjects. August 12th report. Growing concerns about patient TC's influence on the hospital population. Suicide rate in his ward has increased 300% since his arrival. Staff report patients becoming increasingly agitated after private conversations with TC. Patient appears to possess unusual ability to identify and exploit psychological vulnerabilities. Several nurses have requested transfers to other wards. Recommend psychological evaluation of staff exposed to patient. October 31st report. Patient TC has disappeared from the hospital grounds. Last seen during evening meal on October 30th. Extensive search of the facility and surrounding area has yielded no trace.
patient left behind detailed journal documenting behavioral experiments conducted on fellow patients and staff members. Journal contents extremely disturbing. Methodical documentation of psychological manipulation techniques. Detailed analysis of suicide methodologies. Clinical observations of human response to systematic psychological torture. Request immediate consultation regarding potential criminal prosecution. The final report was accompanied by photocopied pages from Timothy's journal. Reading them, I realized the true scope of what I had unleashed. Subject number 23, adult male with depression with suicidal ideation. Initial baseline established through casual conversation. Primary fear, abandonment by family. Secondary fear, professional failure. Tertiary fear, meaninglessness of existence. Applied graduated pressure through carefully timed comments reinforcing each fear category. Subject responded as predicted with increasing social withdrawal and expressions of hopelessness. Terminated experiment on day 12 when subject achieved full psychological breakdown. Subject number 31, adult female with anxiety disorder with paranoid features. Exceptional subject for manipulation due to pre-existing trust issues. Utilized validation technique initially to establish emotional dependency. Gradually introduced doubt regarding staff motivations and medication efficacy. Subject became increasingly isolated and suspicious. Final phase involved direct suggestion that the hospital staff were conspiring against her. Subject attempted escape on day 18, suffered fatal cardiac event during restraint procedure. Note: adult subjects more susceptible to existential fears, meaninglessness, abandonment, failure, while child subjects respond more strongly to immediate physical threats. Staff members display professional vulnerabilities that can be exploited through appeals to authority and medical competence. Page after page of systematic documentation. Timothy had been conducting psychological experiments on helpless patients while the hospital staff unknowingly facilitated his research. Most disturbing was his analysis of the institutional environment itself. The institutional setting provides optimal conditions for psychological experimentation. Subjects are isolated from external support systems, medicated to reduce resistance, and naturally inclined to trust authority figures. Staff turnover is high enough that consistent observation of subject deterioration is unlikely. Medical framework provides cover for experimental activities. Subjects who break down psychologically are treated as treatment failures rather than victims of deliberate manipulation. Timothy Caldwell hadn't been rehabilitated by institutional treatment. He'd been educated by it. I traveled to St. Louis immediately upon receiving the final report. What I found at Missouri State Hospital was a psychiatric staff in crisis. 7 patients had died during Timothy's residency, officially from suicides and medical complications, but staff members whispered about the strange boy who'd somehow been present for each tragedy. Dr. Wickham met me privately, his usual professional composure cracked by months of inexplicable psychological casualties. That child isn't human, Dr. Harding. I've studied criminal psychology for 15 years, treated dozens of antisocial personalities, but nothing prepared me for Timothy Caldwell. He didn't just lack empathy, he weaponized that absence. He turned our own therapeutic environment against us. Wickham handed me Timothy's journal, its pages filled with the careful handwriting I'd learned to dread. He was studying us, Dr. Harding, learning our methods, our weaknesses, our fears. Half my staff requested transfers after interacting with him. 3 nurses suffered complete psychological breakdowns. 2 doctors are still receiving treatment for anxiety disorders that developed during his residency. Where do you think he went? Wickham walked to his office window, staring out at the hospital grounds where Timothy had disappeared. Anywhere he wants. He's learned everything our profession knows about psychological manipulation. He's had access to our patient files, our treatment protocols, our staff evaluations. He understands human psychology better than most trained psychiatrists. And he's still growing, still learning. We have to find him. Dr. Harding, that boy could be anyone now. Any charming child in any city. Any helpful student in any school. Any polite young man in any community. He's learned to blend perfectly into normal society while conducting his research. We'll never recognize him until it's too late. That night, in my hotel room in St. Louis, I reopened my journal for the first time in nearly a year. October 31st, 1868. Timothy Caldwell has escaped. I thought I was solving a problem by having him institutionalized. Instead, I provided him with advanced education in human psychology and access to vulnerable subjects for experimentation. The monster I tried to contain has become something far more dangerous. He's no longer just a killer. He's a predator who understands the human mind better than any of his potential victims. God help us all. I've created something truly unstoppable.
Epilogue: The Legacy of Timothy Caldwell. Podcast transcript. True Crime Deep Dive. Episode number 247. Hosts Sarah Chen at Criminal Mind Cast and Jake Morrison at Deep Dive Pod. Published October 7th, 2025.
All right, crime junkies, buckle up because today's case is absolutely unhinged. We're diving deep into the Timothy Caldwell files, and trust me, this story hits different than your typical true crime narrative.
No cap, this case has everything. A child psychopath in 1867 Missouri, systematic psychological torture, and a mystery that's still unsolved after 150 plus years, plus modern connections that'll make your skin crawl.
So picture this. Post-Civil War America, everyone's dealing with trauma, and into this broken world steps an 8-year-old boy who's basically the prototype for every fictional serial killer you've ever seen in movies.
Except he's real, and according to recently declassified documents, he might still be out there.
The original case files were sealed until 2020, when a descendant of Dr. Samuel Harding donated his personal papers to the Missouri Historical Society. What they revealed is honestly nightmare fuel.
Dr. Harding kept meticulous records, medical observations, behavioral analysis, even copies of Timothy's own journals. This kid was conducting psychological experiments that would make modern FBI profilers uncomfortable.
And here's where it gets really wild. Timothy didn't just disappear in 1868. There are documented sightings across America for the next 50 years. Always the same pale-eyed boy, always associated with unexplained deaths, always managing to vanish before authorities could investigate.
But Sarah, tell them about the modern connections, because this story doesn't end in the 19th century.
Right, so fast forward to 2019. A psychiatric hospital in Oregon reports a series of patient suicides that followed the exact same patterns documented in Timothy's journal. Same manipulation techniques, same psychological pressure points, same methodical escalation.
Staff members describe encounters with the patient who displayed unusual maturity and unsettling intelligence. Security footage from the hospital shows a figure moving through restricted areas, but the video quality is too poor for identification.
When investigators tried to locate this patient's admission records, they discovered something impossible. The paperwork listed his age as 8 years old, but it was dated 2019.
Either someone's playing an elaborate hoax, or Timothy Caldwell has found a way to maintain his physical appearance for over 150 years.
Oh, wow, guys. We're getting live comments from listeners, and okay, this is actually creepy. Multiple people are saying they've encountered children matching Timothy's description in their communities.
User at Nightmare Nurse says, worked pediatric psych in Seattle 2023, had a patient exactly like this. Pale eyes, unnaturally mature, other kids were terrified of him. He vanished overnight. Administration claimed no record of admission.
At True Crime Mom reports, my daughter's elementary school had a student like this last year. Super polite, helped teachers, but kids started having nightmares after talking to him. Family moved away suddenly mid-semester.
This is genuinely unsettling, people. It's like Timothy Caldwell has become an urban legend that's actively manifesting in real locations.
But here's the thing that really messes with my head. What if Timothy was right? What if he wasn't unique? What if there are others like him and they're all still out there, learning from each other, perfecting their methods?
According to modern criminal psychologists who've studied the Caldwell case, his techniques were incredibly advanced for the 1860s. We're talking about psychological manipulation strategies that weren't formally documented until the 20th century.
Dr. Elena Vasquez from the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit went on record saying Timothy Caldwell represents a theoretical nightmare scenario, a psychopathic individual with superior intelligence who views human psychology as a science to be mastered rather than experienced.
And if he's somehow still active, he's had over a century to refine his approach. Modern technology, social media, digital communication. Imagine what someone with Timothy's abilities could accomplish with access to those tools.
All right, crime family, here's where we need your help. If you've encountered anyone, child or adult, who displays the behavioral patterns we've described, please be careful. Don't confront them directly, document everything, and contact local authorities.
And definitely don't try to be the hero in this story. Timothy Caldwell spent his childhood studying how to break people psychologically. If he's still out there, he's had 150 years to get better at it.
Links to the full case files and Dr. Harding's journals are in our episode description. But honestly, maybe don't read them right before bed.
This has been True Crime Deep Dive. Stay safe out there, and remember, not all monsters look like monsters.
Author's note: the open file. The Timothy Caldwell case remains officially unsolved. While the original 1867 incidents are historical record, modern sightings exist in a legal gray area. Too similar to be coincidental, too impossible to be factual. What we know for certain: Timothy Caldwell was real. His documented crimes occurred exactly as described. His escape from Missouri State Hospital was never explained. Similar incidents have been reported across America for over 150 years. What we don't know: whether Timothy survived beyond childhood, how many others like him exist, whether the modern sightings represent the original Timothy or copycat individuals, what his current research might involve. In 2024, the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit created a special classification for cases displaying Caldwell pattern characteristics. The classification remains active, with ongoing investigations in 17 states. The case file remains open. Evolution, as Timothy once observed, never stops.